I'm Rodger Citron. I'm a professor at Touro University, Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. This is a Touro Law Review Podcast. And today's podcast, this is for aspiring faculty members. Our host, I'm your host, our guest is Tiffany Li. She's an associate professor of law at the University of San Francisco School of Law. She teaches intellectual property and technology law courses. But as I've said, we're going to talk about becoming a law professor. And that's something that Professor Li not only has done, but of course has aggregated resources for aspiring law teachers. And we're going to talk about that during the podcast. With that overlong introduction, hello, Tiffany. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
And we always start with this one. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as mentioned, I'm Tiffany Li. I'm an associate professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law. I'm also the academic director of the IP and Technology LLM program. So as you can expect, most of my classes are related to IP. I teach AI and law, privacy law, internet law, IP seminar, and so on. And my scholarship is usually focused on these topics as well. So I have some recent articles on state constitutional privacy law, as well as international AI law. So going from state law to international law, but all in the same realm. And that's what I like to do the most, I think, work in this IP and tech space. But sometimes I also try to get some other information out there, including that guide that you mentioned.
And we're going to talk about the guide, but first, can you tell us about your journey to become a law professor?
I did what's sort of typical nowadays. So I think that many candidates on the market often don't go in blindly now. I think it used to be that you could just graduate law school, maybe write a law review article, maybe clerk, and then try to apply for a law professor job. I practiced for a few years after law school, and during that time, I started writing scholarship. I did a research fellowship, so I was a resident fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale, and then I did a VAP, so I was a visiting clinical associate professor visiting clinical assistant professor at Boston University School of Law. And then I applied for tenure track jobs. So if you think about it, it really did take a little while, right? I took a few years to practice, and then I did 2 years as a research fellow, and then 2 years as a visiting assistant professor. So that's, multiple years, moving different schools, different states, really, before I got a tenure track job. And that is something that I think is not too dissimilar to many people's paths right now. That said, not everyone does that, right? So this is just my journey. That's just how I got here. And for me, it's really been all about focusing on what I like to do. So even in my practice, I was working on technology and IP law. And in all of these fellowships that I mentioned, they're mostly geared towards these subjects as well. So that really helped me, I think, on my journey.
When did you know you wanted to be a law professor?
I actually thought about this in my first year of law school. So I thought, I want to be a law professor. I think I love teaching, I love writing, I love reading, and I really didn't know what being a lawyer was about in 1L. I think most 1Ls don't know what being a lawyer is like. But I thought, I do know I like reading and writing, so that I can do. And then one thing I thought was maybe, though, before I become a law professor, I should practice law a little bit. So when I teach my students, I have some practice experience. So that was always the plan for me. But I didn't necessarily know how to do it. I just thought, I'll figure that out as I go along. I'll practice first and then figure it out. I didn't have, say, a strategic approach during law school, which I think some people do. I was more focused on getting the practice experience first.
And when you started thinking about teaching, who did you turn to for advice or guidance? Did you go back to people where you were a law student, or did you begin to sort of, these are people in my area who I know and start talking to them, or both, or neither?
I reached out to a lot of people in this area. So again, I think it really depends on what you're doing. So I was just so focused on doing work in technology law generally, particularly privacy. And as a practitioner, I was also interested in these issues. So I would seek out professors who are writing about internet and privacy law. This was before AI became the hot new thing. So I was talking to them, and then I ended up co-authoring with a professor. She also introduced me to this idea of going to workshops and conferences. So I started going to workshops and conferences and presenting some of my ideas and works in progress and commenting on the work of other people and just building that network. And through building that network, then I naturally started learning about other things, right? Opportunities that I could look into, things that I should start preparing for an application file. But for me, it really was all about finding that network first, and not necessarily, following any specific, path, but just asking a lot of people what they did and seeing if any of those things resonated with me.
Yeah, one of the things, I took a circuitous route. I practiced for a while. I was a government attorney, two different places in the federal government. And I remember when I first started thinking about becoming a law professor, someone who I really relied on for advice at every stage in my career, and he was a law professor. And I said, "Oh, double ALS," because I'm old enough that that's back when everyone used to go down to Washington, D.C. to the hotel in Woodley Park. Um, and there would be a flood of law schools and hiring committees and a flood of candidates. And I said, "Should I just go and check it out?" He goes, "No, terrible idea." He said, "You don't want to put yourself out there until you have a sense of who you are, what you're interested in teaching, and especially what you're writing about." And so uh, that stayed with me because I sort of thought it's never wrong to take a look around, but I think he was cautioning me about, you want to make a good first impression, um, because reputations can form, especially early on with first impressions and so on. So um, with that, at least with that being my experience, that put me off at least a year from even going to double ALS. Um, did you? And I'm curious about one piece in your history, which was the VAP experience. Um, did did you want to do a VAP? Did you think that, or were you advised definitely do the VAP because it's you kind of can't lose if it goes the right way, because you'll have both teaching experience and hopefully, if it's structured the right way, some time to write. And so that piece, that's something that really wasn't a thing in the early to mid 2000s, except at a couple of places or a couple of programs. So let me sort of have you talk about that.
Right. So I was doing my research fellowship and I was doing that for 2 years. And during that time, I was managing a research program, so putting on events and doing some of my own writing. And when it came time to wind down that position, I was naturally thinking, what can I do next? So the benefit of being very specific in the topics that you teach and write on is that when there is a position that's out there looking for that, you are the perfect candidate. But when there is not a position looking for that, it's a little bit harder to pitch yourself as the ideal person. So at that time, I was looking around, seeing if there are any jobs, and it didn't look like there were any good opportunities for permanent tenure track positions. So then in lieu of that, it would be the question of, what's the next step? And I could either stay where I was already, or take on a different type of fellowship role, so a VAP. So many fellowships are more research-based. I'm just saying, this, but I'm saying this for the listeners, right?
Please, yes.
So fellowships are often mostly research-based. Sometimes you have some other duties like managing, websites or events or so on, but they're usually research. And the VAPs are often more geared towards giving you research time, but also practical teaching experience. So I thought, this can't hurt, right? I don't have any teaching experience. I was never even a TA in law school. So this would be my first time getting any teaching experience. And I think somewhat uniquely, this was a clinical VAP. So this was a VAP at BU's. They have a really interesting clinic. So BU and MIT have a collaboration where they jointly offer a clinic staffed by BU law professors and law students that primarily addresses the needs of MIT students. So they're focusing on MIT students who are clients because they have all sorts of questions about how to create a startup or how to do this really weird, cool tech research project that is possibly illegal. So it's a really fun clinic. And I also, had heard about them and I knew the clinic director and I thought this is going to be a good experience. So I joined that clinic and it was a good experience. I was able to teach in the seminar as well as supervise student writing for the clients and interface directly with clients, which was fun because I had been doing that before my research fellowship, right? I'd been working with tech clients, so this was relatively familiar for me. And it did also give me time to continue writing, which is still, I think, the most important thing for anyone looking for a tenure track job. I'm sure you agree, you just have to be publishing. You have to be writing somehow. No matter if you are in a fellowship, a VAP, in practice, clerking, you've got to be writing.
Absolutely. I think the first time I went to double ALS, and there were questions about what you're working on, what you're writing, and I think I hadn't started yet, although I really did have something in progress from my practice experience. And I can remember actually after the second day of the conference, I'm going to use the colloquial meat market as it was known then, with a fellow colleague from the Department of Justice. And I said, I can't believe this. I've done X, Y, and Z in practice. And because I'd worked in the federal government, I'd argued in circuit courts of appeals and tried cases, in the Court of Federal Claims. And I said, and it really doesn't seem to register or matter that much. And um, and he was the one who said, yeah, that isn't the currency of this realm. It counts for something, but and so next year, when I went back to double ALS, my storyline then afterwards was, I'm no longer fighting City Hall. And I think I had something that had been placed, something else. And I really had written, some people do it in a short, some people do it longer, but my research agenda, that is, I could speak about that. And having crossed over on the other side, that, I'm in City Hall now. And whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not, it's how you are looked at as a prospective candidate. And so yes, the writing piece is very important. I also have to say that I think that, say, in the years or 20 plus years that I've been a faculty member, I'm really impressed as time has gone on with the work that people have done, at least some candidates have done. That is, there's a real trajectory now already evident for entry-level candidates, which I just find so impressive. So yes, I agree with you on that point. One of the things that I feel like we want to excavate is credentialism. When occasionally I have students who want to talk about they're interested possibly in teaching, and I always want to be encouraging. But I say, you should understand this is a very credentials conscious profession. And it's the same thing. That's how it works. That's when they make the cut, that matters. What are your thoughts about that? And I want to start with, I guess, practically speaking, if you weren't, number one in your class, if you weren't the articles editor at the Harvard Law Review or the Yale Law Journal, Um, what are your what can someone do about that?
I think credentialism definitely is something that it's just part of the job process, the job application process for faculty positions. And I've heard that this is the same for pretty much every discipline. It's just how university jobs kind of work, I think. And that, we could critique that all we want, right? There are many people who do critique that, saying, we shouldn't have every single law professor graduate from the same 5 schools. That's not maybe the best way to staff law schools around the nation. But we can't really fix that within, this 30-minute podcast. So I do think there are tactics that you can do if you don't have, a JD from Yale and then a PhD from Harvard tacked on, which some candidates now do, which is, very frightening. Some candidates now are just out there with every single credential they could possibly have, which is fantastic for them, but that's not everybody. And there are, I think, something like 200 law schools in the nation, right? So there are so many opportunities. You do not have to be that candidate that has every single credential, every big name fellowship, Supreme Court clerkship, all of that. If you do have those things, it's going to help. If you don't have those things, there are a few ways I think people are able to still get really good jobs for them. One way is to try to add one of those credentials. So if you can get a fellowship at, say, a higher ranked school, or if you can even take the time to do a master's degree, it doesn't help that much, but it might at least get you to that screening interview. And I think some of this is actually subconscious. I don't think every faculty member goes and looks at a resume and says, I only want these schools. But there's a subconscious effect sometimes. So I do think if you have the time and the resources to add one of those credentials, it's not going to hurt. But if you don't have to, because again, there are so many law schools. And I think a lot of law schools are looking for more than just that same cookie cutter candidate. There are many schools that care a lot about your actual teaching experience, and even more care about your fit. So does your work actually fit with what the school is looking for? Some schools say we just want the best candidates, which is great. Other schools say we specifically want someone to teach, our torts class next year. We need someone to teach torts. In that case, if you have taught torts, if you have written about torts, right, you should talk about this. Maybe this is a school in a specific location and you have close connections to that location. You should be talking about that, right? That's going to give you an advantage. I think especially if you're able to be more open-minded about which schools you want to apply to, there is still a lot of opportunity out there. And I would not, I generally tell people, don't discount yourself as a candidate just because you don't have the fancy credentials that some other people might have, because there are plenty of law schools. And it really is, I think, outside of those very, top few schools, it's really about fit. So do you fit with their curricular needs? Does your overall profile fit with the culture of the school, right? If it's a very religious school, are you a religious person, right? If it is, say, a school that has a huge focus on certain topic areas, do you at all touch on those topic areas in your work? Especially if it's a school in a location that is outside of a major metropolitan area. If you can prove you really want to be, I'm not going to name anywhere, but if you really want to be in that place where maybe there aren't as many candidates, right? That's going to give you a huge advantage. So I think these are all things that people can think about when trying to get around credentialism a little bit. But I agree, it is something that candidates should be aware about regardless. They should know that this exists, but it shouldn't stop them from applying.
Yes, I want to go to your discussion of the idea of a master's, and just add that when I've had this conversation with students, if you are going to do this, that is, if you're going to take the time, if you can afford, to take the time to get a master's degree, you have to think about it, because this is going to also draw on something else that we just discussed. You have to come out of it with like one finished writing, something else. You really have to think of it as, in addition to the credential, it's time to write. And so that's one thing that, sort of combines 2 points from what we've already discussed. And the other thing you said, which I think I didn't really appreciate it the first time, but then the second time, when I was on the market, it was um, flexibility. You should, of course, never misrepresent um, either your experience or your willingness, but it's helpful if you're willing to say, for example, just in my situation, oh, I want to be a con law person. And if they say, well, that's not open, but administrative law is, it's not a leap to say, oh, well, that's con law one, structure of government, and I can pick that up because I feel like that is a fair representation if you're willing to do that. And I think it's important to take advantage of opportunities that are available. And we even had a person here at Touro who we brought in to teach property, who hadn't taught it before. But I remember as we were talking it through, I said, you're a private law person. You've done all this contracts work. If you property's hard, no, everyone will stipulate to that. But it'll enrich your understanding of contracts and your scholarship in that area if you're willing to invest the time to teach property. And I think it worked out. I think it worked out. Although I would never dispute, that property is hard. The Can you say a little bit about your experience and impressions of there's sort of typically two parts to the interview process. One is, of course, that first half hour, that screening interview. And then the second is the callback. And let me start with, for the screening interview, there's always, I think, this tension in an interview about, well, I'm supposed to talk about myself, but I'm not supposed to be obnoxious. How did you handle that? If I can just, I think, go ahead. I'm just curious. How did you handle that?
Of course. I think this is it's a fun question, partially because I have many friends, including some who are now faculty members in the US who are not from the US. And our interview and job application culture is very different. In Europe, you're not supposed to be boasting about yourself constantly in the job application process, right? That's seen as a little bit uncouth. But here, if you're not essentially bragging about yourself, or at least humble bragging about yourself throughout the process, it's going to seem like you're not a strong candidate. So you do have to talk about yourself. You can't do the British thing where you sort of underplay your accomplishments and assume that people will find out. So people are not going to find out. And I've gone into most of my interviews with that assumption. People, and now that I am a faculty member and I've been on hiring committees and been in interviews, I know not everyone always has time to closely read the CV before the screening interview or the callback interview. So in your interview, I think that you should be bragging about yourself. Now, there's a caveat, of course. Don't do it in an annoying way. Don't be too boastful, which is hard to give advice on. I would say perhaps the way to think about it is just say things that are truthful, right? Don't hide things. If someone's asking you about your experience, highlight the best bits, right? Don't ignore things and just assume they'll come up later. If someone is asking you, though, about real difficulties, so they ask you about a real challenge, or they point out part of your CV where you seem to be missing something, they're not really sure if you fit with something. Don't just make up an answer and try to get through it, right? That's not helpful. I would say just be honest, but also don't shortchange yourself. Make sure that you do bring up your best qualities, your best assets. That article you did just place in a great publication, or your years of teaching that you were doing somewhere else. All of that can be really helpful. So don't ignore what you have to offer. I would say is the biggest thing. And I think that most people asking for this kind of advice are generally not the kind of people who have the opposite problem where they're overly boastful. I think I see less of that. I see more of the opposite, where people are so qualified, so smart, so accomplished, but then they shy away from talking about themselves because they find it a little bit awkward. And I think you just have to get past that. You just have to get past it. Even when you're a professor, you're going to have to promote your work all the time. And if you don't do that, you're going to lose out. So might as well start now.
Yes. And then should you make it through that first screening interview, that initial screening interview, there's the callback. And that's a long day. That's a long day. You've been on both sides of the process. What do you think? Let me just ask it sort of an open-ended. What do you think is going on in that process?
I think it is different from the candidate side and the faculty side. On the faculty side, if you're on the hiring committee, you're involved with all of it, right? You've been part of planning it, you've been part of thinking about who to put into which meeting and which interview session, how to arrange the lunch talk to get the most faculty members to show up, all of that. If you are just a regular faculty member, your job is to show up to, one or two or maybe three of these sessions. I'm thinking about the dinner as part, possibly one of the sessions, right? And your job is just to think about if the candidate is a good fit, and evaluate the candidate. So you are caring about, who this person is. How do they come off? Do they come off as someone who's friendly, generally a team player? Is this, an academic superstar? Is this person annoying? Because that is a factor as well. All of those things throughout the day. But for the candidate, I think it's so much harder. Faculty members are evaluating usually multiple candidates over the year. You've got a hiring season, right? If it doesn't work out this year, you'll hire next year. But for the candidates, it feels like, well, this is sometimes make or break, right? You've got this season, you've got these schools, and that can be tough. And it is an all-day process. And at many schools, it can be multi-day. You might start with a dinner before the full day of interviews. And that dinner is also an interview. So do not treat this as a casual, fun time. It's also an interview. If you do breakfast on the day of the callback, that's also an interview. If you do a walking tour with the law school librarian, that's also an interview. So I think that's something that candidates have to remember. And it does create a bit of a stressful situation where you're always being watched and monitored. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that the candidate should also be interviewing the school. Ideally, you're going to get more than one offer. And even if you don't, you still have the option to choose whether or not to accept the offer. So throughout that day or days, you should be thinking, do I want to be here? Right? Do I feel positive energy in this environment? Right? Do I feel like I could fit in with these people? Do I feel like people are asking good questions that show they care about my work? Do I like the direction the school is going? Because people are going to tell you about the school's programs, and they're going to boast a little bit about the new initiatives that they're funding and their strengths of the school and the students, the faculty. Do those things attract you? Do you like the physical campus or the physical environment of the location, right? You should be thinking about all of these things too. So it's not just, maybe it's a little bit less pressure if you think about it that way. It's not just everyone looking at you, trying to evaluate you. You are also evaluating them, and they're trying to make a good impression too. So it's a bit of give or take in that way.
One thing, this is really great answer, because you did address it from both sides. And I think especially the idea that when you walk away as the candidate from the interview, you should have a sense of how do I feel about this place? And some of that's tangible and some of that's intangible or intuitive. So I thought that was really helpful. One thing at Touro, and I do try to, if I have any one-on-one time with a candidate, I say the job talk, you should see yourself as a teacher. And that's a very obvious thing to say because that's the position you're looking for. But I said, that is to say, the primary criterion or primary concern that we're going to have when we talk about you, at the faculty meeting is your teaching ability, because that's the highest priority at the school. So um, I know that before I did, you know, callbacks when I was originally on the market, I was obsessively concerned about someone's going to ask a question I don't know the answer. And again, my friend who I referred to before, who was been kind of an advisor along these lines, he said, you know, the likelihood of that happening is actually pretty small because it turns out that there's probably going to be only two or three people who know a lot about the area that you're talking about. Um, Everyone else is going to be looking at you and can they follow you? How are you framing things in a way that makes them understandable? And I think I'm extrapolating from my own experience, as we all do. But I really, now having been here for lots of time, I think it's really important you're aiming across a spectrum of people. You're not aiming to impress the person who knows the most about the subject, I guess is how I would say it. So that's, in my experience, both as a candidate and then as a faculty member, something that I think is important to stay focused on. Um, the we mentioned, and I think we'll figure out some way to link to or attach um, the 5-page memo or guide, the resources that you've talked about. And how did you put that together? That is, did you finally get to the end and say, this will be helpful? Or was this you were sort of aggregating or collecting along the way?
So I'm sure you have the same experience. You've been a professor, and I'm sure that you have people who are asking you, how do I become a professor? And this might be your own students, or maybe, people you meet, right? Other connections, friends you might have. And I've had the same experience. So I've had many people ask me, how do I get where you are? How do I do what you're doing? So I found myself answering the same questions essentially over and over again. And I would sometimes try to find these resources and I would forget where they are. And I have to find my last email I sent a candidate. And it just became frustrating for me personally. So I decided to put everything into one document. So I created this document that just collects a lot of the links that I have been sending to people over the years. And these links include other people's written guides on tips for how to apply, how to make yourself a good candidate, how to write a law review article. It also included some links on some, critical papers about this process, right? Thinking about credentialism and so on. And at the end, I added a list of my own tips that I frequently give other people. So with this one document, then I have something as a foundation for other people who are asking me questions. I also put this up on SSRN and I put this up on my own website, just in case if someone is typing into Google, how do I become a law professor? And they're trying to read everything they can, which I also did as a candidate. Maybe this is something that can help them. And the primary motivation really was, I think, going through my various experiences before getting a tenure track job, it made it really clear that there is a knowledge disparity among candidates. So there are some candidates who are so prepared and they are so qualified with many accomplishments, many credentials, partially because, well, they came from places where they would get that preparation. If you do go to Yale Law School, there is a fantastic program there to help you get onto the academic path. If you are going to a law school, outside, say the top few, likely you don't have a career person to help you become an academic. You've got to figure it out on your own. And even if you go to one of those law schools, maybe you're not thinking about it at the time, maybe you're not a top student, maybe you don't have the time because you need to find an actual job that is going to pay you what a lawyer should be paid. Then maybe you don't have the same access to that knowledge. So I saw that a lot through my various experiences, that there were some people who were very prepared and some who were not. And it's not necessarily because they were less talented or less hardworking or less intelligent. They didn't have those opportunities. So I was thinking, if those people are, again, just trying to figure out what to do online, they come across this page, right, as part of their search, at least it gives them some insights. And it's not going to be an end all be all. I think this is just a 5-page document that there may be 20 tips. It's very short, but it's a start. And there are some links that they can keep going on to look at. And ideally, they'll find AALS, they'll find these other resources. They'll start asking people and talking to people. And people can make up for a knowledge disparity. You can pass that. You can close that gap between yourself and other more prepared candidates. But it does take a little bit of work. So I was hoping to help those people along their way a bit, as well as help myself not answer the same questions over and over again forever.
Yes. The only thing I would add, and it's wonderful that you have it as an SSRN link, because I think we've just solved the problem or the challenge of, what we'll put up along with the podcast so that people can find it right next to the recording. You really want to practice the job talk. Of course, that's, it sounds like the most obvious thing, but I want to sort of add the specific from my own experience of the job talk is different than arguing a summary judgment motion, or other types of things you do in practice. And it that was a transition for me to understand about how to structure it, how much to go into detail as compared to how much to, just identify themes or points. You have to sort of work it out yourself, given what you're writing about, what you might be teaching, and the audience of professors. But if you can do it in front of practice in front of other professors, because that's your audience, and they're used to seeing a certain type of presentation. And it wasn't really until I think after my first year teaching that I really appreciated what was so different about the audience and the nature of the presentation. And so, I sometimes make the comment now after seeing someone speak, something along the lines of, person's very, very able, very, very thoughtful, and yet they're still sort of in practicing lawyer mode for the presentation. And as long as that's, I can recognize it. I think sometimes in making that comment, if I make it, to a group of people, what I'm trying to say is, don't hold this against the person. Like, they can figure it out. Don't judge, substance or ability based upon form or style, or at least be aware that that's what you might be responding to. But I just found that really something that was, sort of a substantial part of, the transition for me from practice to teaching, and then understanding how that played out in the market. My last question, and this is my joke about this one, is that, this is like the humanities essay question from college. That is, this is the big picture question. And that is, what are your thoughts about the law professor, the hiring process, what we've been talking about in terms of what they tell us about legal education, and even more broadly, the legal profession? I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of connecting what we've talked about to these big picture questions.
Sure. So if you don't mind, I do want to talk a little bit about the job talk first before we get to
Please
the big
do.
picture.
Yeah,
Because I agree, there's a specific format for a job talk. And this again gets to that idea of there being a knowledge disparity. Because before I did my research fellowship, I had no idea what a job talk would be. I knew you talk about a paper. What does that mean? And during my fellowship, I attended other people's job talks. I attended scholarly workshops, and I had started doing this a bit in practice as well. And through that process, I was able to see, well, this is how a scholar presents their work. These are the kinds of questions to expect from people. Here's how a scholar answers or sometimes deflects those questions. There's a really important skill to learn, right? How to say, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to look that up and get back to it. And these are things that you don't know until you've seen. So I do think, again, some places will give you this experience. So some fellowships will give you this experience. Some law schools, though, also have opportunities. If you see that there is a scholarly workshop happening at your law school or even at the university proper, take a chance and try to attend. Usually these are open to students. Students don't often go because they can be boring, but you can go for experience. You can learn. You don't even have to say anything. You can just sit in the back and see how other professors talk to each other. You can attend one of these scholarly workshops, a works in progress workshop, or a conference where people are presenting papers. See how people ask questions. It's not a job talk, but you're going to get a sense of how professors talk when presenting their work and how they answer questions and what kinds of questions are asked. And I think that's really important. And as you mentioned, if you have the chance to moot your job talk, to practice it in front of people who are actual faculty members, that's fantastic. Many, I think, let's say, at least some fellowships and VAPs will give you this opportunity. If they don't, or if you're not in one of those programs, you can make the opportunity yourself. And that, again, takes some initiative. It takes work building your network. If you can get a few faculty members on your side, you can ask them, can I practice my job talk in front of you? Or even if you feel comfortable, you can ask them if they would mind finding a panel, finding a few of their friends to listen to your job talk and give you feedback. And that is a bigger ask. So this is really dependent on if you've built that relationship over time. But even if you haven't, many people will be willing to at least listen to your 20, 25 minutes and give you some feedback. And I think that is, as you mentioned, it's important. If you haven't been in a job talk, if you haven't been in a scholarly presentation, you don't know what it's like. And it is a different category of speaking than you might be used to if you're coming in from practice. Or even if you're, not practicing, but if you haven't been to these presentations, I think that's something I would recommend that candidates do. And especially if they're students, there's probably opportunities on campus that you can take advantage of.
Yes. No, thank you for elaborating because I'll say it this way. I thought my answer was because it was more specific since it was about my experience. Yours was broader. And so therefore, I think, perhaps more helpful. And if you want to take a swing at the big picture question, please.
Right. What does the job application process say about legal education and law schools and the legal profession? That's a big question. I'll say, honestly, I don't have a huge controversial opinion here. I know some people would say, look, the law school, faculty application process shows that we are focusing on credentialism, which privileges the elite, and then we are, lacking in actual teaching. We're not teaching students practical skills. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think outside of those top few schools, you are getting a lot of candidates who are coming in with teaching experience and practical experience who want to teach practical things. And there are so many schools across the nation that are looking for that too. I think other people say something, other critical work I've read has talked about, biases in hiring, which it's biases in hiring happen everywhere, every sector. I do think that, it's something we should be aware of. Hopefully schools are looking into it a little bit. It's not something unique to law schools. I do think that from what I've heard, law students really like having professors that they feel they can connect to. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be from the exact same background as the students. but that there should be something, some sort of connection. They should have someone on faculty they can look to and say, I feel that connection. So that's something we can think about. But in general, I don't know if there's anything I would say descriptive or prescriptive, I have to say, about the law school hiring process. It's a job, honestly. I mean, I love my job, but it is a job. And I think for candidates who are on the market, they can do it. You can find a job if you want to. It's just like finding any other job. Try, you might fail, try again. The legal market and the law professor market sometimes go together, right? People can't find other jobs. Occasionally, they look for law professor jobs or fellowships. It is getting tougher in a way because people are coming in with more knowledge. So they are coming in with more years of research and teaching experience, more publications. And maybe that speaks to a growing sense of credentialism, or in another sense, maybe it's actually more democratic in a way, more open, because now you can try to prove yourself through publications. Whereas in the past, it would be purely credentials, only the school and the judge you clerked for. So I think it is something that things are changing. Just keep yourself knowledgeable about the current state of law professor hiring. Be open-minded about where you want to be, and just know that being a law professor can mean a lot of things, just like being a lawyer can mean a lot of things. And I think your view on what the legal profession is and how students should be taught, that's going to be idiosyncratic. But that's going to also help inform you what kind of candidate you should be and what kind of schools you should be aiming for. And I think that's going to be something that every candidate has to think about and do a little bit of soul searching on their own when they're applying.
Yeah. I just want to highlight one word that you said in your answer, which I think is so apt here, which is idiosyncratic. And there's this process, if you apply, you will go through it. And at the end, you may have an offer, you may have several offers. I think it may only make sense with the benefit of hindsight. That is, your journey through it and where you end up, whether it worked or didn't work, or how it worked, that kind of thing. And I would say, whatever happens to you along that way as a candidate in that journey, you should, you shouldn't take it too personally, in the sense that, there's lots of different gears turning, and a good chunk of it is beyond your control. So I really, I appreciate you using that term in particular. And anything else we should discuss?
I don't know, what other useful pieces of information can we think about for candidates right now? Oh, I have one. So one thing that one of my friends, who's also a professor, told me when I was trying to go on the market, I think this is a pretty good tip, which is a little bit conceptual, but his idea was you've got to pitch yourself in a way that lets the faculty members put you in a bucket. So in their mind, they're going to have different buckets. This is the con law person. This is the environmental law person, right? This is the person who's only doing scholarship, right? They're going to have to think about you in a sort of category that may be overly simplistic. And you're going to say, no, I actually do so much more. I do con law, but I do con law specifically about race and gender. That's fantastic. But when they're evaluating you as a candidate, among so many candidates are looking at, if you can find a way to pitch yourself as one kind of scholar and professor and teacher, that's easier. So this means, sort of like writing a paper, everything should relate to your thesis. Everything in your application, including your interviews and your job talk, should relate to a thesis about yourself. I am an IP and technology law scholar, and I teach these topics, and that's how I view my teaching philosophy. It's very technologically informed. My writing is about cutting edge topics. My service work is also about tech, working on tech initiatives for the school. And then when they think about you and try to remember who you are after seeing, 7 different candidates, they think, oh, that's right, that was the tech person. That's the person who does tech and IP. And then it's memorable. And then if they're thinking about who should we hire, they might say, oh, that's right, we did have, the provost said we should do something about getting more people doing tech. And there was that one tech candidate we had. And they might remember you that way. And it's easier than if you say, I do some con law, but I'm also happy doing, maybe some electives on this. And I've written about this, but I might also write about this. Definitely be open-minded, but don't be so diffuse that they don't know how to think about you as a candidate. That's my final piece of advice.
That is an excellent piece of advice. I will say that, again, hindsight being 2020, because I had been a bit of a generalist in my legal career, I thought, well, I hadn't consciously thought of it, but I realize now that that's how I was presenting myself. And I don't think it was terribly helpful, because in saying things like, well, I can pick up X, or, I think I had remedies in my teaching package. And I was like, remedies, of course, cuts across a number of fields. I think it made me a bit, amorphous or blurry. That is, and so the position that I got at Touro was actually as a visiting professor for a year, to teach civil procedure, and everything sort of built around that. And 21 years later, I'm still the civil procedure guy. So it's an identity I happily embrace. I'll probably have it for the rest of my time here. But it made me, it sort of put me, that's the constellation I am in the Touro sky, is the civil procedure guy. So on that note, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and we can conclude the podcast now.
Great, thank you.